May Calder thought her ranch was all she had left, just dirt wind and a fence held together by rusted nails. But when 10 wild horses dragged a bloodied man into her corral during a dust storm, everything changed. His name was Silas. In his saddlebags, gold stained red. Now whispers trail her like coyotes in the dark. A land broker circling, a dead dog, a town that looks sideways, and a root cellar she keeps locked tight. She gave him shelter. He gave her silence. But can two broken souls survive the storm coming next? And what will they lose just for standing side by side? The storm hit Esperanza Ridge like a door slamming shut on God's patience. May Calder stood in the open barn frame, oilskin cloak flapping behind her eyes, narrowed against the whirling grit. This wasn't a storm for riding or praying, it was one for locking doors and not looking out windows. She had just finished chaining the north paddock gate when the sound came, not thunder, but hooves, not one horse, but many. She squinted into the dust heart, stammering. Through the haze emerged a string of horses, 10, all saddled, no riders. And tied between the lead and the last, slumped low in a sagging saddle, was a man. May didn't think. She ran. Her boots skidded in the mud as the horses broke toward the corral. Out of sheer habit, this land had held livestock since before her husband died. She unlatched the gate, letting the animals pour in and grab the reins of the wounded horse as it stumbled. The man swayed but didn't fall. His hat was gone, hair matted with sweat and blood. She reached up and steadied him. "You hear me," she shouted over the wind. "You alive." He groaned, a soft, guttural sound. She couldn't tell where he was bleeding from, only that his shirt was soaked through. She took his weight, dragged him down. He collapsed in her arms, heavier than expected. She'd hauled hay-fixed gates, buried livestock, but dead weight was different. By the time she got him inside, the storm had swallowed the ridge. The stranger lay across her parlor floor, lips cracked, face pale as moonlight. May worked silently, cutting away blood-stiffened fabric, dabbing wounds with boiled water, stitching the worst of it shut. She was no nurse, but life out here didn't allow for waiting on someone better trained. When she peeled back his shirt, she found something else, saddlebags cinched tight around his waist. May hesitated. Then she opened them. Gold. Raw and crusted flecks of quartz still clinging to some of the pieces. Nuggets the size of walnut halves. Not coins, not jewelry. Straight from the earth. She sat back on her heels. Well, hell. Outside, the storm keened like a grieving widow. Inside, the man stirred. May reached for her rifle. His lips moved. Just one word came out hoarse, nearly swallowed. Silas. He didn't open his eyes again. That night, May didn't sleep. She sat in the rocker by the hearth, eyes flicking between the fire, the man on the couch and the saddlebag she'd stuffed beneath a floorboard. Who was he? A miner? A thief? A dying man in the wrong place at the right time? She'd buried her husband in that same dirt out back 6 years ago, dug the grave herself, swore she'd never owe another man or ask one for anything again. And yet, 10 horses don't drag themselves into a widow's yard every day. Just before dawn, the wind died. May Rose slipped on her boots and stepped into the chill. The corral was quiet. The horses clustered and steaming under the pale orange light. She moved slow among them, studying the brands. None matched each other. Ranches from all over, some she recognized, some she didn't. Stolen. And the man bleeding out on her couch. He'd either stolen them himself or fled someone who had. As she turned back to the house, her breath caught. Tracks. Fresh ones. Not horse, not hers. Boot prints. Deep. Someone else had stood on the bluff last night, watching. May tightened her jaw. She'd already taken the man in, already seen the gold, and someone out there knew. No use running now. She stepped back inside and shut the door behind her, bolting it tight. Then she glanced at the man on her couch, eyes still shut, breath shallow, and whispered to no one in particular. "Whatever kind of trouble you brought, Silas, we're in it now." And from the floorboards below her feet, the gold seemed to hum. By the time the dust settled and the horses calmed, May Calder had already made 2 decisions. She'd keep the stranger alive if she could, and no one was going to see what he'd hauled in with him. She buried the blood-crusted gold beneath the root cellar floor, laying thick canvas over it, and replacing the planks herself. Her arms shook from fatigue, but it wasn't the labor that wore her, it was the weight of secrets. Heavy things, even when buried. Silas hadn't stirred again, though his fever had broken sometime around dawn. He muttered in his sleep snatches of names, broken pleas, and once clear as a bell, they burned him alive. May didn't ask who, not yet. It was mid-afternoon when she heard the knock. Not the urgent pounding of trouble, but the dry, calculated tap of a man who knew his boots were cleaner than hers. May wiped her hands on her apron, checked the latch on the rifle leaning by the door, and opened it 2 inches. Afternoon, Miss Calder said Barlow came tipping his hat like it cost him nothing. His suit was dustless, his mustache trimmed sharp as the creases on his ledger books. "Didn't expect to see you in. I live here," she said flatly, not opening the door any farther. Barlow's eyes drifted past her shoulder. "Word is you've got some new stock." He smiled. "Saw 10 horses up in your north corral. Mighty fine ones. Found 'em this morning. No brands match mine. I sent a wire to the marshal." He raised a brow. "That so?" May didn't blink. "That's so." Barlow scratched the back of his neck, then pulled a pamphlet from his coat. "I'll get to the point, May. Taxes are going up. A lot of folks can't keep hold of this land with the mine traffic rolling back in. Claim markers popping up like dandelions. Hell, I just bought the Miller tract last week. Could offer a fair price for yours. I'm not selling. Not yet," he said with a smirk, sliding the pamphlet into her hand anyway. "But wind changes fast out here, and folks talk quicker than they think. Just saying might be easier to get out before it gets hard to stay." May met his gaze. "You done?" Barlow's eyes flicked again to the house. "Sure hope you ain't got any squatters laying low in there. Would be a real shame. Dangerous, too. Miners are a rough bunch, May. Gold fever makes men foolish." She didn't answer, just shut the door and bolted it. Through the curtain, she watched him walk away, slow, casual, like he owned the land already. That night, Silas woke. May was sitting at the table stitching the seam on a feed bag when she heard him groan. He tried to sit winced, then laid back down. His voice was dry as gravel. "You buried it." May didn't look up. Didn't have a choice. A pause, then smart. She finished her stitch, tied off the thread, and finally turned to face him. "Your name's Silas," she said. "You said that much." He nodded once. "Who were you running from?" He stared at the ceiling a long while, then said, 3 men. Called themselves Fletcher's Crew. Claimed an abandoned shaft 2 counties over. There was gold in it, real gold. My partner Caleb filed a legitimate claim on it before they could. So, they waited until we brought up the load." May's stomach twisted. What happened to Caleb? Silas's jaw tightened. "I ran." "They didn't." She swallowed. "They after you?" He nodded. May stood slowly and crossed to the window. She pulled the curtain back. The moonlit ridgeline stood still and quiet. "You said 3 men." Silas sat up, wincing. "Saw a fire. Just past the bluffs. Last night." May turned to him, her voice low and steady. "So, they're already here." Silas didn't flinch. May crossed her arms. "Well, that changes a few things." And from the corner where her rifle leaned against the wall, the iron glinted in agreement. The storm had passed, but the land hadn't settled. Dust clung to the hills like regret, and even the air felt like it was holding its breath. May Calder kept the horses watered and the doors bolted. Silas healed slow 2 cracked ribs and a bullet grazed to the thigh, but he was stubborn and quiet, which May counted as virtues. By the 3rd morning, he was limping out to help fix a fence post she'd been meaning to replace since spring. "You sure you're up for this?" she asked, not unkindly, handing him a post maul. He gave a dry half-smile. "Sitting's worse." They worked in silence for a while. The sun crept higher, cooking the dust into a haze. As May knelt to check a cracked insulator near the eastern fence line, she caught sight of something jutting out of the dirt. At first she thought it was just another splintered cedar stake, but when she brushed away the grit, her fingers struck metal. A worn brass survey marker nearly rusted to nothing, with initials scratched in the top. "C.M. May," read aloud. Silas froze. He limped over, knelt down beside her. "Caleb Madsen, my partner." May stood wiping her hands on her jeans. "So, this exact line was part of his original claim." He nodded, eyes scanning the dry slope beyond. He talked about marking it clear just in case something happened to him. May looked out past the wire fence. Beyond the brush, her land sloped down into a cluster of scrub oaks and dry gulches, land she never used. Always figured it was too unstable for grazing. "There's a cave," she said suddenly. "Half collapsed, maybe 2 ridges over. My husband said it used to be a shaft before the war." Silas's jaw tightened. "They weren't after my life, May. They were after this dirt." She let out a low breath, heart ticking faster now. Which means he added Barlow Kane wasn't just sniffing for your ranch. He knew. May turned back toward the house where the shadows fell long, and the root cellar stayed locked. That night, they sat at the kitchen table under lamplight. Silas had sketched the shape of the ridge, as he remembered it from Caleb's map, rough lines, creek bends, and an X over the slope May now realized sat on her property's southeast tip. "Do you still have your deed papers?" he asked. May nodded, already pulling a worn tin from the cabinet. Inside were folded documents, some official, some yellowed with age, all of them signed by a notary, long since buried in Esperanza's old churchyard. Silas studied them with careful hands, then pointed to a clause in small, fading print. "This tract includes subsurface mineral rights," he murmured. "Not all deeds do." May raised an eyebrow. Meaning Barlow can't touch this land, not legally, but if he gets you rattled enough to sell, he can bury that clause under paperwork and claim the shaft outright. May crossed her arms. "And if I file a boundary reaffirmation, it forces the county to acknowledge what's already mine." He nodded. "Exactly." She tapped her knuckles on the table, thinking. "I'll have to ride into town, bring a copy, pay the filing fee." "I'll go with you," Silas said. May looked at him. His face was still pale, and he winced when he shifted in the chair. "You can barely mount a horse. I can sit in a wagon and carry a rifle," he said, voice quiet but certain. She stared at him a moment longer, then gave a single nod. Outside, the wind picked up again, just a whisper this time, but it carried something different, not dust or fear. Movement. May stepped to the window, heart thudding. Far off on the bluff above the gulch, a figure stood still, as stone watching the house. The silhouette shifted, then disappeared behind the ridge. Silas moved beside her, his voice low. "We're not the only ones who remember that claim." May's hand slid toward the rifle hanging by the door. "No," she whispered, "but we might be the only ones who still believe in doing it right." Sunday came with that soft hush. Only church mornings brought, dull settled boots cleaned, and the town of Esperanza Ridge pretended for a few hours that it still held some kind of peace. May hadn't planned on going, but Silas had insisted. "Paperwork's filed," he said, buttoning the second-hand shirt she'd found in an old trunk. "Now we watch the town, see who twitches." May eyed him. "You think they'll just show their cards?" "Not if we ask," he said. "But if we stand still long enough, someone will flinch." She didn't like it. Didn't like the thought of dragging the man they were whispering about into the center of it. But she didn't like hiding either. So she tied her hair back, pulled on her cleanest blouse, and loaded 2 baskets, one with biscuits, the other with preserves. At the edge of the churchyard, they blended into the crowd just enough. Silas kept to her elbow, walking with a quiet limp that looked more like an old wound than a fresh one. His face had healed, but there were still shadows beneath his eyes. The town's new preacher, a red-faced man with more chin than scripture, gave a brief sermon about honesty in times of prosperity. His voice cracked on the word prosperity, as if the word didn't sit right in his mouth. After the benediction, folks wandered to the open green behind the chapel. Picnic tables, gingham cloths, and sweet tea in mason jars. May stood by the pie table nodding polite hellos. Silas stayed near the fence line where he could see the whole gathering. Barlow Kane arrived late naturally, dressed sharper than Sunday required with a bright red necktie that didn't match anything but his own sense of self. He made rounds like a salesman clapping backs, smiling wide, and then like a man playing poker, he laid his first card. "Afternoon, folks," Barlow called out loud enough to turn heads. "Beautiful day, ain't it? Of course, some say trouble's been blowing through lately." May felt the weight of every eye shift. Barlow didn't look her way yet. He sipped lemonade, lips curling at the edge. "Seems there's been strangers keeping company in places they don't belong. Makes folks nervous, you know, especially with mineral rights stirring up again." The pause that followed was thin and brittle. May's shoulders tensed, but she said nothing. An older woman leaned in close. "He means you," she whispered. "You know that, right?" May smiled without warmth. Let him mean it, but Silas saw it too. The way the air shifted. The way folks looked, then looked away. And one man, grizzled, toothless, leaning against the oak tree, caught his eye. "You Fletcher's boy?" the old man asked, voice dry as straw. Silas turned slowly. "No, but I knew him." The prospector gave a slow nod. "Then you better know this. His name still means something around here, not good something. And that woman." He pointed a knobby finger toward May. That ain't her first warning. Silas narrowed his eyes. You mean threats? The man shrugged. Same thing if you squint. May approached just then carrying 2 empty jars. You ready? She asked quietly. He nodded once. Yeah, let's get off their stage. They walked back to down the dirt path, the church bells long since faded. Behind them, the picnic chatter resumed, but it felt different now, like a current had passed through and folks weren't sure what it left behind. Back at the ranch, Silas leaned against the porch post, watching the ridge as twilight rolled in. May stood beside him. I know what Barlow's doing, she said. He's not trying to scare me. He's trying to sour the town on me. Make it easier to sweep in after the mess. Silas nodded. He's laying kindling. May looked up at him, her voice steady. Then we'd better be ready before he strikes the match. And just then a breeze shifted across the land, cooler than before, the kind of wind that carries warning, or the start of a fire. 2 days after the church picnic, May Calder rode into the county office with her boundary reaffirmation in hand, jaw set tighter than a bad weld. She'd worn her father's coat, the one with the inside pocket big enough to carry every land deed they'd ever trusted. Silas sat beside her in the wagon bed, a rifle tucked beneath a tarp, and a watchful eye on the trail. No one tried to stop them, but both of them noticed the dust cloud rising behind them for at least half the ride back. Someone's keeping tabs, Silas muttered, gripping the side rail as the ruts got deeper. Not the sheriff. Too subtle. May didn't look back. Subtle's worse. Subtle knows how to wait. They reached the ranch by sundown. May fed the horses, watered the chickens, and boiled coffee, with an extra dash of chicory, an old habit her mother had taught her for unsettled nights. Then just past midnight, the barn dog didn't bark. He whimpered. May grabbed her lantern and stepped out barefoot into the chill, only to find him crumpled near the hay trough, throat slit clean and quiet. No mess, just a message. She stared down at the stillness, heart a stone in her chest. Silas found her there minutes later, boots crunching soft over straw. They're done hinting, he said quietly. May nodded once. Time to move the gold. They worked fast. May packed it into flour sacks and carried them 2 at a time to the smokehouse, the oldest, thickest-walled building on the property. She buried the gold beneath the old salt pit, covering it with cured hides and sawdust. You think they'll come tonight? She asked, voice low. Silas checked his traps, 2 at the rear gate, one hidden near the creek bed. They've been here. I'd expect they'll come again bold this time. May tied her hair back, then loaded the shotgun she'd kept since the day her husband never came home from town. You should hide, Silas told her. She looked him square in the eye. You're on my land, remember? He didn't argue. They waited inside, lamps out, weapons close. Every creak of timber sounded like an oath. And then shuffling, hoofbeats faint, a crunch of boot on loose gravel. 3 shadows moved toward the barn. May whispered, how many traps, 2 by the fence, 1 in the dry creek bed. The barn door creaked open, then snap. A man screamed. Silas slipped out the side door with the rifle. May moved to the kitchen window, breath steady. The second man kicked open the back door. May fired once clean through the curtain. A burst of gunpowder, a howl, then scrambling feet. The third attacker never made it inside. Silas tackled him down the slope, wrestling the rifle from his hands. But the man twisted free and vanished into the trees. May ran out, shotgun raised. You all right? She called. Silas nodded, breathing hard. 2 are down. 1's gone. May looked toward the barn. Blood stained the ground near the trough. The wind stirred a slashed curtain, and among the chaos, something flickered. A burned matchbook, dropped in the dirt, charred but legible. Barlow's Dry Goods, quality you can trust. May picked it up, lips tightening. Silas limping over, eyeing the item. Guess Subtle's off the table now. May said nothing, just stared toward the dark hills where the last man had fled. Then she turned, voice sharp and calm. We go to the sheriff in the morning. Silas hesitated. You sure he'll listen? No, she said, gripping the matchbook, but he'll have to answer. And for the first time since Silas had tumbled into her corral, half dead. May. Calder felt something stronger than fear. Purpose. The sheriff's office sat like a graying tooth at the end of Esperanza Ridge's only paved street, whitewashed, sun-blistered, and tired from too many years of quiet compromise. May had never liked stepping through its doors, but that morning she and Silas did just that. Sheriff Emery Daltrey looked up from a half-finished breakfast of dry biscuits and cold ham. His uniform was pressed, but his boots had the lean of a man who hadn't run toward trouble in a long time. Well, now he drawled, eyes flicking from May to Silas and back again. Didn't expect to see you two in so early. Something wrong with your livestock? May set the scorched matchbook on his desk. Daltrey picked it up, read the label, then gave a slow, measured whistle. Barlow's, huh? Silas spoke next, voice even. 3 men came to the ranch last night. One's still out there bleeding. They weren't there for livestock. Daltrey leaned back in his chair. And you didn't think to come in right away? We handled it, May said. That a confession to violence, call it defense of property, she replied. The sheriff rubbed his chin. And what exactly were they after? May didn't answer. Not directly. But Silas did. They want a mine claim buried under her land. They want what my partner died for. And Barlow Kane's behind it. Daltrey's eyes narrowed slightly. Those are heavy accusations, son. Especially when you're the one came limping into town 2 weeks ago with no name, no papers, and blood on your boots. May stepped forward. You're deflecting. No, Daltrey said. I'm considering the full picture. Then he stood, reached behind the desk, and pulled out a pair of iron cuffs. Silas Reeve. I'm placing you under arrest for suspicion of murder and mineral theft. You can deny it in court. May's voice cracked. You're arresting the wrong man. Daltrey didn't blink. I'm keeping peace. If there's a legal claim, you'll present it at the town meeting Friday. Until then, he stays in the cell. Silas didn't resist. He held May's gaze as the cuffs clicked shut. Don't let them scare you into silence. She stared after him as Daltrey led him into the back and shut the iron door. The quiet was worse than shouting. Outside, the air bit cold despite the sun. May stood frozen on the boardwalk. Townsfolk passed without speaking. She could feel them watching, whispers curling under their breath like smoke. She made her way to the telegraph office, sent a wire to the territorial office requesting certified copies of her deed. She asked the clerk about court dates. The man wouldn't meet her eyes. By noon, she walked to the church and sat in the third pew where her husband once fell asleep during long sermons. She didn't bow her head. She stared straight ahead, fists clenched in her lap. Footsteps echoed down the aisle. It was Sister Elta, retired teacher, part-time organist, and a woman who'd buried more neighbors than she cared to count. She wore black always. You've got fire in you, girl, Elta said, settling beside her. But fire burns if you hold it too long. May swallowed hard. They arrested him. They'll try to bury the rest. Elta reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded sheet of yellowed paper. 15 years ago, I saw Barlow Kane pay a drifter for government stamps. The preacher at the time, Elias Dunham, told me those deeds weren't right. Said Barlow forged one over in Bridger County. Then the preacher had a stroke. Took the truth with him. May unfolded the paper, an old county newsletter. One column was circled. County clerk raises concerns over land claim fraud. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? May asked. Elta's eyes didn't flinch, because back then no one would have listened. But they're listening now. You just have to speak loud enough to make them squirm. May stood, hands trembling. She wasn't just protecting land anymore. She was about to go public. And if Barlow Kane wanted to play this through a courtroom, she'd give him an audience he wouldn't forget. Friday morning broke sharp and dry, the kind of day that crackled with tension before a storm. Esperanza Ridge's town square filled slowly, neighbors, drifting in with folded arms and half-swallowed opinions. No one spoke loud, but everyone had shown up. Because when mineral rights were in question, and reputations on the line, every man, woman, and drifter wanted to be present for the fallout. May Calder stood in the center of it all, not with a raised voice or a dramatic entrance, but with a canvas-bound folder under one arm and her shoulders squared like fence posts. She wore black, simple, neat, and solemn, as if mourning the truth before she had to fight for it. Sheriff Daltrey leaned near the gallows post, eyes flicking toward Barlow Kane, who arrived with polished boots and an easy grin, tipping his hat, like a man arriving to claim what was already his. Let's get to it, Daltrey said, clearing his throat. This meeting was called to settle disputes over land boundaries, mineral access, and a recent arrest involving Mr. Silas Reeve, currently in custody. Barlow stepped forward first, as expected. I'd like the record to show that May Calder's homestead sits atop a previously unclaimed shaft. It's my belief that gold extracted from that mine, if it exists, was done so illegally. I've filed intent to purchase the land under eminent domain should the court find her claim invalid. A murmur rippled through the crowd. May didn't move, Not until Daltrey nodded her way. She stepped up, set the folder on a hay bale-turned podium, and unbuttoned the flap slowly. What I'm about to share ain't just about me or Silas. It's about how a man like Barlow Kane has made a living betting no one would notice. She pulled out a set of hand-drawn maps, surveyor's notes, boundaries drawn in black ink, signed and stamped by a man long since buried, Preacher Elias Dunham. This is my original deed registered 17 years ago, including mineral rights on the southeast bluff. That same bluff was marked again by Caleb Madsen Silas's partner before he died. Both maps align. Both place the mine on land that's already mine, Barlow scoffed. Hand-sketched papers. Come now, May. She met his eyes. You want county copies? I have 'em. Certified on Tuesday. The sheriff stepped closer, taking one of the stamped documents. His brow furrowed. This one's valid, Barlow. May didn't stop. She held up the old county newsletter Elta had given her. And this, it's an article from the year you forged deeds in Bridger County using black market stamps. Same year, you started buying up foreclosed tracts after pushing families off their land with fake notices. That's slander, Barlow snapped. May's voice never rose. Then explain the drifter who sold you the stamps. Name was Eli Durham. Got picked up in West Bank 2 months later, carrying 24 forged federal seals. Guess whose name he gave in his confession? Silence. Then from the crowd, 2 voices piped up. First, Gabe Turner, the town's only notary, stepped forward. I witnessed a signature once. Thought it odd, same hand on both buyer and seller. Second, Thomas Miles, the feed store owner. Barlow offered me cash to say I saw May remove old claim markers last week. I didn't, so I didn't take it. Barlow turned to Sheriff Daltrey, voice sharp now. You're gonna believe them over me. Daltrey said nothing. But he reached up slowly and removed his badge. Then he looked at May. I think we've heard enough. Silas walks free, and this town deserves better than backroom games. May's knees nearly gave out, but she stood straight as the oak behind her. As Barlow sputtered, caught between protest and retreat, the crowd began to shift, not with rage but with recognition. Sometimes justice wasn't loud. It just needed to be undeniable. Silas was released before the sun hit the peak. He didn't say much when he stepped outside, just looked at May and tipped his hat. But in that look was every word he didn't need to say. You didn't run. You didn't bend. You stood. Barlow Kane didn't come quietly, but the moment the sheriff stepped aside and let the crowd close in, he knew the tide had turned. His voice, once smooth and smug, cracked as he shouted about legal rights, property leverage, and ungrateful townsfolk who didn't know the value of ambition. But no one listened. Because when lies collapse in the town square, they fall louder than gunshots. Sheriff Daltrey, standing with his badge pocketed and jaw locked, handed Barlow over to the 2 deputies from Bridger County who'd arrived just before dawn. They'd ridden in dusty and silent, holding a copy of the drifter's confession and a signed warrant for Barlow Kane's arrest on fraud forgery and conspiracy to defraud the county. I always knew he was slippery, one deputy muttered, binding Barlow's wrists. Just didn't know how deep he'd buried his claws. May didn't watch Barlow get hauled off. She stood at the edge of the square, hands in her pockets, watching Silas. He hadn't said a word since stepping out of the cell. He just kept rubbing at the spot where the shackles had been, as if the skin still remembered. You all right? She asked finally, voice low. Silas nodded. I will be. They walked back to the ranch in the late afternoon heat, saying little, but something had shifted, like the weight between them had been rebalanced. The next morning, May rose early and made coffee strong and black the way her father used to drink it. She took 2 mugs out to the porch. Silas was already there, barefoot, watching the horizon where the ridge met the sky. Didn't sleep much, he said, accepting the cup without looking at her. Me neither, she said. Thought too much. Silas glanced sideways. About what? May looked down into her cup. What to do next? They sat in silence a while. The breeze carried the scent of sage and the faint rusted scent of old gun oil from the porch bench. Finally Silas spoke. The gold's still buried under your smokehouse. May nodded. We could turn it in, he said. File it with the state. Get a payout. Might take a year. Might take 10. I don't need more gold, May said softly. Not if it brings more men like Barlow sniffing around. Silas turned fully toward her now. Then what? She looked out at the land, at the way the cottonwoods leaned the creek, winding lazy through the brush. We bury it, she said. Deep, where it started. We let the land keep it. Silas didn't argue. He just rose from the bench, stretched, and said, I'll fetch the shovels. They buried the gold where the stream bent under a stand of cottonwoods with roots strong enough to hold secrets. May packed each nugget in cloth, not one piece spoken over. No ceremony, just quiet shoveling and shared breath. When they finished, Silas tamped down the dirt and stood back, hands on his hips. "We ought to plant something here," he said. "Mark the spot, not for memory, for peace." May thought a moment. Cottonwoods grow fast, good shade, and they don't need much asking to thrive. He smiled faintly. "Sounds like someone I know." She rolled her eyes, but her mouth twitched into something soft. "You staying?" she asked, not teasing. Silas nodded once. "Don't got anywhere to be. And I'm tired of running from ghosts." May looked toward the house. "There's work here. Always more than one person can manage." He stepped closer. "Then maybe two's the right number." That night, someone left a loaf of warm bread on May's porch, still wrapped in cloth, no note. But May didn't need one. The town had spoken in the only way it knew how, quiet, neighborly, and just enough to say, "We see you now." And when May and Silas sat by the fire that evening, there were no what-ifs or what-nows. Just coffee cooling in mugs. And a stretch of quiet land that finally, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to them both. Summer came late that year, trailing behind April's frost like a second thought. But once it settled, it brought warmth not just to the land, but to something else May Calder had long buried under fences, checklists, and cautious mornings. The Calder Ranch didn't change overnight. There were still broken boards to mend goats that got in to feed they shouldn't, and the same old pump that moaned louder than a Sunday sermon. But something was different. It started with the orchard. Silas spent 3 days digging out the cottonwood grove near the creek, the same spot where the gold had been reburied, and planted new saplings in straight lines. Peach plum and apricot, said it was good to grow something sweet after all the bitterness they'd weathered. "Trees don't argue," he said, tapping soil around the roots. "They just hold fast and give when the time comes." May watched from the fence, arms folded. "You just like not getting talked back to," he grinned. That too. They named it the Madsen Grove after Silas's partner. No sign, no ceremony, just a quiet place to remember someone who never got the chance to plant anything himself. Word of Barlow's downfall traveled slow but steady. Folks who once avoided May in the mercantile now tipped their hats. The mailman stayed longer at the gate. The preacher's widow brought over fresh corn muffins with extra honey for strength, she said. And then came the children. At first it was just two, a brother and sister from down by Copper Bend, their father asking if May might give riding lessons in exchange for fresh eggs. May agreed. Soon 3 more showed up, one with a crooked hat, one with a lisp, and one who clung to the saddle horn like it might fly off without him. May taught them to ride. Silas taught them to respect the animals. And when the weather turned too hot for chores, they all sat in the shade while May pulled out her mother's slate board and taught letters. "I thought you didn't like children," Silas teased one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. May shrugged. "Turns out I just didn't like the silence." One morning in August, a drifter came up the main trail. Tall, lean, quiet boots, dusty eyes, road-weary. He didn't ask for food or money, just pointed to the cottonwoods and said, "Who planted those?" Silas stepped off the porch. "We did." The man nodded. "Good trees. Roots hold, even in fire." Then he tipped his hat and walked on. Later that evening, as the sun dripped low behind the ridge, May turned to Silas. "Why'd you stay?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just watched the horizon where the shadows stretched long and thin. Then he said, "You gave me room to heal. Not questions, not shame, just a place to breathe." May looked down at her hands. "You gave me windbreak, and someone to drink coffee with at sunrise." They sat on the porch steps until the stars came out. No more running, no more secrets. Just land work and the quiet understanding that what they'd built together fence by fence, morning by morning, meant more than any claim, any deed, or any gold ever could. A month later, the town held its annual harvest dance. May didn't go. But that evening, someone left a jar of spiced cider on her porch tied with a red ribbon. Inside was a note in a child's shaky hand. "Miss May, I want to be strong like you one day. Grace." May stared at it a long time. Then, with a soft breath, she set the jar on the windowsill beside her mother's sewing tin. Outside, 10 horses grazed quietly in the paddock. Not one of them had ever been claimed. And May figured maybe that was the point. Some things you don't claim. You just stand beside them and let them stay.